Today, we are not here to talk about a simple marital conflict. We are not here to decide who is right and who is wrong. And this is certainly not a piece of content designed to blame or accuse anyone. What we are doing today is far more fundamental. This lecture is for those who find themselves trapped in repeating cycles of anxiety within relationships. For those who genuinely want to protect, love, but somehow keep falling into patterns of control and suspicion. And most importantly, for those who have quietly asked themselves, why am I this anxious even when nothing has happened? Most people explain pathological jealousy as a problem of emotion. They call it jealousy, insecurity, or attachment anxiety. But that explanation is incomplete. Jealousy is an emotion. Obsession is a behavior. What we are dealing with today is neither. We are dealing with a structure. From a philosophical standpoint, human beings do not live in the present. We live in what we anticipate. We imagine events that have not yet occurred. We feel those imagined events as if they were real. And then we judge our present reality based on those imagined futures. At this point, I want to introduce a classical idea not as religion but as psychological insight. There is an ancient text, often referred to as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. While it is widely known as a guide to the afterlife, at its core, it is something else entirely. It is a map of the human mind under the influence of fear. It describes what happens when consciousness becomes trapped in its own projections. When fear generates illusions, and those illusions begin to feel like reality. One of its most striking insights can be summarized like this. The forms that arise in fear are not reality. They are projections of the mind. This is precisely where we must begin to understand pathological jealousy, because what appears to be suspicion toward a partner is, in reality, something much deeper. It is the act of living a future loss before it has happened. Within this structure, the person you love is no longer seen as they are. Instead, they are unconsciously replaced by a different figure, the one who will eventually leave me. And once that figure appears in the mind, the relationship begins to shift quietly, but fundamentally. The purpose of this lecture is simple. If we treat this condition as a mere emotional problem, we will not solve it, we will reinforce it. Explanation increases. Reassurance repeats. Restrictions tighten. But anxiety does not disappear, because the anxiety is not coming from facts. It is coming from an assumption, the assumption of inevitable loss. This lecture is for three kinds of people. First, those who blame themselves, asking, why am I like this? Why can't I just trust? Second, those who are exhausted from constant suspicion, yet have no idea how to respond without making things worse. Third, those who are ready to confront a difficult truth. That control, when justified in the name of love, may not be love at all. So today, we define this condition differently. Pathological jealousy is not the suspicion of present behavior. It is the acceptance of future abandonment as a certainty. It is not jealousy. It is not obsession. It is not loving too much. It is a psychological defense system built on a single premise. I will eventually be abandoned. And from that premise, a strategy emerges. A strategy to control the present in order to survive the imagined future. If we fail to understand this structure, every conversation becomes a battle of explanation and persuasion. But once we understand it, we can finally change the question. Instead of asking, why are you so suspicious? We begin to ask, why are you living as if the future has already been lost? That question changes everything, because now we are no longer dealing with behavior. We are dealing with perception. And perception shapes reality far more than facts ever could. In this first part of the series, we will dissect this structure in detail. We will examine how it unfolds in three distinct psychological stages: the preparation for disappointment, the prediction of betrayal, and the rehearsal of emotional pain. By the time we reach the end of this introduction, one thing should already be clear. This is not a story about suspicion. This is a story about experiencing the end of a relationship before it has even begun. So now, we must ask, is this really about doubting infidelity, or is it something far more profound? A structure in which the moment love begins, the mind quietly begins preparing for its end? Let's move into the main discussion. And if this perspective helps you see relationships differently, consider subscribing and share, because confusion in relationships is not something anyone should have to face alone, and understanding is always the first step toward freedom. So now we move from understanding the structure to confronting it in reality, because insight alone does not dissolve a pattern. Structure reveals itself most clearly not in theory, but in how we respond inside the relationship. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They assume that more explanation will reduce anxiety, that more detail will restore trust, that if they can just say the right thing clearly enough, logically enough, the cycle will finally stop. But the opposite is true. When anxiety is driven by imagined futures, language does not clarify reality. It feeds the imagination. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a concept known as the bardo of confusion, a psychological state in which the mind, overwhelmed by fear, begins to generate its own illusions. In that state, complexity does not help. Complex language expands illusion. Simple language weakens it. Let's make this concrete. If a wife asks, "Who are you with?" and the response becomes a detailed narrative. "Well, there were people from the sales team and a few from development, and one colleague named." That is not reassurance. That is raw material for imagination. The correct response is radically simple. Just people from work. And then stop. Because in this structure, names become triggers. Every added detail becomes a new thread for suspicion to follow. The same principle applies again and again. Did you come straight home after dinner? If the answer turns into a long defense, "Yes, I really did. I came straight home, didn't stop anywhere, nothing happened," it will not calm the situation. It will be interpreted as defensiveness. And psychologically, defensiveness is often decoded as, "There must be something to hide." So the correct response remains, "I came straight home, nothing more." Now here is the most important principle in this entire process. When additional questions come, you do not change your answer. You repeat it. Because the moment your wording shifts, an anxious mind does not hear nuance. It hears inconsistency, and inconsistency is immediately translated into, "The story is changing." So when asked again, "Are you sure nothing happened?" the wrong response is to elaborate further, to defend your character, to explain your intentions. The correct response is, "There was a work dinner. It ended at 9, and then repeat it exactly the same way, over and over, because repetition in this context is not avoidance. It is an anchor to reality. In the same way that repetitive mantras are used in states of mental turbulence, a consistent sentence interrupts the spiral of projection. Debate escalates anxiety. Repetition exhausts it. If she asks, "Then why do you look so tired?" and you begin to explain the atmosphere, the conversations, the context, you reopen the loop. Instead, you return to the same anchor. "There was a work dinner. It ended at 9. Because here is the underlying psychological mechanism. Anxiety feeds on new information. Repetition removes novelty. And without novelty, the emotional circuit gradually weakens. In this sense, what we are dealing with is not just relationship conflict. It is a form of perceptual distortion under emotional pressure. Again, if we borrow the language of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this is not simply a conversation. It is a relational bardo, a state where words are no longer received as truth, but as signals that either amplify or dissolve illusion. And this leads us to a crucial conclusion. What is needed here is not more explanation, but less stimulation. So the principles become very clear. Speak only the essential facts. Do not change your wording. Do not attempt to persuade emotion, because this is not about winning an argument. It is about interrupting a cycle. Control is not love, and explanation is not an antidote. Sometimes the most powerful form of stability is calm, consistent repetition. Now let's go deeper. The second major mistake people make is trying to argue with the emotion itself. But emotional expression in this structure is not a request for logic. It is a release of internal tension. So when someone says, "Why would you even think that? That doesn't make any logical sense. You're overreacting," these responses do not resolve anything. They intensify the core fear, the fear of abandonment. So instead, the response must separate two things: emotion and reality. For example, I understand that you feel anxious, but that suspicion is not a fact. Notice the distinction. You acknowledge the emotional experience without validating the distorted conclusion, because understanding anxiety is not the same as agreeing with it. Now, the third principle. Do not immediately comply with verification demands. Instant responses, answering every call, sending photos, sharing locations, may feel like reassurance, but psychologically they function as reinforcement. They teach the brain, when I feel anxious, control will resolve it. And once that pattern is learned, the demands will not decrease. They will escalate. So instead, respond with a consistent delay. Maintain the stance that not everything requires verification. Do not comply with excessive demands, because the principle is simple. Immediate compliance does not heal anxiety. It conditions it. Fourth, do not attempt to prove your innocence. The moment you enter the framework of proof, you have already accepted the rules of the game. Statements like, "Check my phone if you want. Bring me evidence. I'll prove it to you." These may temporarily reduce tension, but they transform the relationship into a courtroom. And once that shift happens, the burden of proof never disappears. It only increases. So instead, the stance must be consistent. I do not participate in a relationship that requires proof of innocence. Fifth, do not negotiate with controlling demands, because every accepted restriction becomes the baseline for the next one. If you say, "Okay, just this once, I won't see that person anymore. I understand you're anxious." In that moment, anxiety gains authority over your behavior. So the alternative is firm but non-aggressive. I'm not going to accept that request. No long explanation. No defensive tone. Because the principle is clear. When you compromise your boundaries, you don't create peace. You erase structure. Finally, define the relationship clearly in language. Silence is often interpreted as agreement. So boundaries must be spoken. For example, I don't accept a relationship without trust. Your anxiety is valid, but control is not. This relationship cannot be maintained through surveillance. These are not attacks. They are definitions. And definitions are what stabilize structure. So if we summarize, do not explain excessively, state only facts. Do not persuade emotions, acknowledge, then separate. Do not respond instantly. Maintain controlled timing. Do not prove innocence. Refuse the framework. Do not accept control. Hold your boundary. Will this immediately change the other person? No, but it will do something more important. It will stop the structure from growing. And that is where real change begins. Because what we are confronting here is not a person. It is a system. And systems do not collapse through argument. They collapse when their reinforcement is removed. So now we arrive at the final question of this part. What happens next? If explanation stops, if boundaries are established, if the cycle is no longer fed, does everything become calm? Not quite. Because when control weakens, the structure does not disappear quietly. It resists. In the next lecture, we will examine that resistance. Why emotional explosions suddenly occur. Why roles of victim and aggressor begin to reverse. Why things seem to stabilize only to collapse again. And most importantly, where must you stand firm and where must you step back? Let me leave you with one final idea. What appears in fear is not always reality. Sometimes it is only the mind projecting its own ending. If this perspective has shifted how you see relationships, consider subscribing and share, because cycles like this do not end through effort alone. They end through understanding. And understanding, once seen clearly, has a way of changing everything. We'll continue in the next part.